Welcome to That You Might Believe, a study in the Gospel of John, looking at the themes and ideas that the community of John wrote to articulate who Jesus is and why that matters in our life. And so we're picking those apart. I'm Rustin.
I'm Danielle. I was just thinking when you said articulate, who Jesus was, or raise more questions about it.
Yeah.
Like questions for us to wrestle with, in a good way.
In a good way.
Yes.
Yeah, I love the questions. I personally believe that questions are better than the answers most of the time. So they take us in better places, right? Like you have all the answers.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Then you're just done.
Yeah.
But
right.
New questions, man, they get you going deeper and wider than you ever expected.
Yes, they do.
So we're on the sixth sign that Jesus does, and it's the healing of the man born blind. And I love this story too, right? This is the one where...
This is like 100 verses long, isn't it?
It's
so long
virtually
because...
all of John chapter 9.
Yeah, it's huge. It's a huge story.
And we've read it.
Yes.
We read it earlier on in this study, so we're just going to recount it for you. Virtually what happens is Jesus sees a blind man, he offers to heal him, and he spits in dirt and creates a mud paste and puts it on the guy's eyes, and then tells the gentleman to go wash his eyes in the pool of Siloam, I think.
Yep.
And he does, and he sees.
Yeah.
And then...
everybody starts questioning Jesus.
Well, everybody starts questioning the blind guy.
Oh, yeah, like what happened? Who did this to you? What's going on?
Aren't you the guy who we've seen begging by the street corner all of your life? Like, you were born blind, aren't you? What's going on? And he's like, I don't know. I was blind, and now I see.
Yeah.
It's the greatest lines in Scripture, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I was blind, but now I see. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders get involved, and they
say, who did this? And he's like, he's gone now. I don't know where he is.
I have no idea. I was blind when he put mud in my eyes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So who am I supposed to know?
Yeah.
And then in walks Jesus.
Yep.
And the guy says, oh, I recognize that voice, in essence. He's the one who healed me.
Yep.
And everybody's like, did you heal him? And he's like, yes. And then they go get his parents, the blind man's parents.
Yeah.
This is my favorite parts of the story, too. They go with the parents because the parents are supposed to be responsible for him.
Mm-hmm.
But the parents' answer, because they're afraid, is we're not responsible for him. He's an adult, but he was born blind.
Yeah.
That's all we know.
Yep.
Like, he left our house. He was blind. We couldn't take care of him anymore. That's why I was begging by the side of the street.
Yep.
And so what's he say? So then they go back to the guy, and he's like, listen, I was blind. Now I see.
Go talk to the guy who did it.
Figure it out.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't know what else to tell you, but, like, something's wrong with you, not me.
So then they don't even know. This is really interesting. They don't even ask how Jesus heals him. Like, they don't say, how did you do that? What happened?
Right.
They say, why was he blind? We want to know why he was blind. So who sinned to make this man blind?
Yeah.
Was it his parents or was it him? And once again, as is true in the Gospel of John, Jesus says you're totally missing the point. Like, that is not the point. This is not about sin. This is not about somebody doing something wrong. This is about healing and new life.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, you're upset because your order got disordered.
Yes.
Not because a blind man now sees.
Because, you don't have the kind of power you once had if someone else is walking around and healing blind people with mud.
And, like, again, what you're afraid of, what they're afraid of, is that their power is being challenged. Yep. And Jesus, like, in light of all of that, you're missing the beauty of what happened.
Yep.
Right? I didn't do this to challenge your power.
Mm-hmm.
I did this because there was a blind man who needed to see.
Yeah.
So Doug, in his Outdoing Jesus, The 7 Ways to Live Out the Promise of Greater Than, where he looks at these signs, says that this sign is the sign of participation. That it's the invitation to participate in the bounty and beauty of God all around us.
So to celebrate that the blind can see,
right,
instead of asking the questions and trying to get at the root of what happened and trying to see if this person deserves it almost,
right.
Do you think?
Yeah. And like, trying to turn it into a philosophical lesson
Yeah.
instead of a moment of participating in the, right? Like if what Jesus says in, Luke chapter 4 in his first message is, I've come that those who are blind might receive sight.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's part of the whole point.
Yeah.
And you're missing it. And this is what Isaiah proclaimed, right? It wasn't something that Jesus initiated and said. Isaiah said it in Isaiah chapter 62.
Yeah.
And Jesus just reads it and says, okay, this is fulfilled.
Here I am. Yep, this is happening now.
Do you want to participate?
Yeah. Somebody
Right.
just preached on that passage.
I know. Me
People
today.
could look that up.
Yeah. You'll see it Sunday if you watch. This will be actually.
This will be after, so you can
but
look it
yeah.
up. You can look
Yeah,
up
totally.
Rustin's sermon on John chapter 4.
From June 21st, if you needed a date,
Yeah.
actually.
There you go.
So, it's just, it really is, I like that the definitive of, like, this is about us participating. Like, we get invited, this sign is about inviting us to take part. Like, to just release ourselves into, I was blind, but now I see.
I had one of my favorite classes in seminary was taught by a woman named Marianne Mai Thompson, who's a John scholar. And she would, that word participation, she would say we have to participate, or John invites us to participate in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in the bringing of the miracles, right?
Yeah.
Because in bringing of the signs that, again, you will do greater things than this. So this is not a sideline faith we're supposed to be building for ourselves.
No, yeah.
This is right in the thick of it, putting our own spit in the mud, which I think is another way of saying getting your hands dirty,
Yeah.
to actually get into the mess of people's lives with them.
It's, it's the word that keeps popping into my head as we've been doing these signs is so much of them are about relationship, right? Not just relationship with God and Jesus, but relationship with the guy that you walk past every day who's been sitting at the gate asking for money from you.
Yeah.
That we don't get to walk through life and not pay attention to that person and be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
They're equal people.
Yes.
And, part of what the blind man says is, I have sight. I think you guys might be the blind ones,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
In relationship to the Pharisees and the religious leaders, he's like, all of the stuff that's keeping you from seeing what's happening here,
Yeah.
I think you're the blind one now, right? And that's a choice not to participate.
Yeah.
It's a choice to judge and evaluate everything versus to participate in it.
Yeah.
And as a person who is personally pretty cynical at times, I think that's one of the things that happens the more cynical we become. Right? So, in this story, if I'm honest with myself, I might have been the religious leader being like, help me understand what's happening here.
Yeah.
By comparing it back to the law versus just celebrating and being like awakened to the relational paradigm that's happening in this moment.
Yeah.
Like, because my general bend at these moments in history are kind of cynical. Like, okay, come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's convicting in that sense. Like, how do we break through that cynicism and choose to participate in the relationship versus our cynical way?
And I think in all these stories, what struck me as you were just saying that is that, Jesus is interrupting the systems and the rules and the laws and the ways of being the people were holding more tightly to than they were holding God. And so all these interruptions are reminder. I mean, we are interrupted and we need to be interrupted. And might it be that in the interruptions, God arrives, or God is wanting to
present.
arrive if we will kind of give ourselves over to the interruption.
Yeah. I think about, as you say that too, the part that we call the intertestamental period between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament being written was about 400 years. And there's books in the Catholic Bible that tell us what happened in that period.
I mean, it's like 9 generations of people.
That's like 9 generations of people. And it's like the beginning of slavery to now, right? Like comparatively, it's like
as far as the length of time. Yeah, yeah.
Right? So when you compare those two paradigms, that part of what they learned in the intertestamental period over 400 years was that God had stopped speaking to them, and that the only way that they could maintain relationship was by holding tightly to the law, holding tightly to the last thing God said.
Yeah.
And I think one of the beautiful parts about this participation kind of narrative for me is just because you felt like God's silent for a period of your life doesn't mean God's going to remain silent.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
can we remain, and to use your words, can we be open-handed enough
Yeah.
to say, I haven't heard from God in a while, and so I'm doing what the last thing he told me to do is, and I'm looking for God to speak again.
Yeah.
Both and.
Yes.
Right? I'm not just believing that God's never going to speak again, so we just have to keep through with the way we've been doing stuff.
Yeah.
But perhaps moments like these in our human history where there are protests and riots and those sort of things are the exact moment where God's voice is being manifested.
Mm-hmm.
Moments like when Jesus shows up and starts healing blind people,
Yeah.
right? These kind of disruptive moments, as you're talking about,
Yeah.
where the challenge is how do we hear God
Yes. Yeah.
and not hold tightly to our old ways?
Yeah. To what we always thought should be, or the last big thing. Yeah. The last big thing we thought was from God. Mm-hmm. It's important too. God doesn't need us to defend God. I think that's part of what Jesus is trying to say too. Like,
Yeah.
you think you're defending God
Right.
with all your rules, with all the stuff you've put in place, with all the ways that you're holding on to these old systems. God doesn't actually need you to do that. God needs you to give yourself over to what's happening now, to notice what's happening in front of you. So I always love it. I've said this before in other classes we've taught that, when we do new member classes, a lot of times Jared will say, the last time you had a transformational moment with God was when you were in high school or college. It's time to meet God again. It's time to look for God. And so I say that to us, if the last time we experienced God was a long time ago, it's time for us to wake up and see what's happening and join God in what is happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, yes, that's such a good story.
It's such a good story. And then it drops us into the discourse about Jesus proclaiming that he's the light, right? So what does light provide? Sight, right? Like in darkness,
Yep.
nobody sees anything.
So just like the blind man will see, all of us will see because Jesus is the light.
Right. And you can still choose darkness, right? Like the Pharisees did in this moment with the blind man.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can choose to go blind.
Mm-hmm.
You can choose to be blind. Then this is talking about more of the spiritual blindness than the physical blindness. The Pharisees had a spiritual blindness.
Yeah.
And so part of what comes out of this, and we're not going to read this whole thing because we're going to do it next week, is Jesus naming that he is the light and that he'll relieve us from darkness. So you want to read that? The John chapter 8, just do verses 12 through 20.
Okay, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Then the Pharisees said to him, You're testifying on your own behalf. Your testimony is not valid. Jesus answered, Even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid, because I know where I've come from and where I'm going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. You judge by human standards. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is valid. For it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. It's your law, in your law, it is written that the testimony of two witnesses is valid. I testify on my own behalf, and the Father who sent me testifies on my behalf. Then they said to him, Where's your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. He spoke these words while he was teaching in the treasury of the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. John says that, we noticed that in one of our other stories, that John said that exact same phrase. There's this sort of, for such a time as this moment, and this, I think, John alludes to the idea that, the fulfillment was not quite there. So all these things are kind of leading up to or piling up to the fulfillment of
the death and resurrection
yes,
narrative
of Jesus' call, if you will, although it all matters.
Yeah, in fact, I think in John it matters even more, right? Like, I think one of the things we would hope as theologians and pastors is that people wouldn't just glam on to the death narrative and that be their only theology, but that they would have the theology of Jesus' life and resurrection as well, and that the death is just a single, 3-day moment in a 30-year lifespan that had a ton to teach us. And that's where John's getting at, like, look at what his life taught us, right?
Yeah.
That his life led to his death, but it led to his death because he was breaking down walls, right? Mm-hmm. He was releasing captives and freeing the oppressed, and in the midst of all that, it got him in trouble.
Yep, and upsetting the power structures. And Jesus was put to death for how he lived.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And he was resurrected for how he lived. And so in the midst of all of that, you have him engaging them, again, the Pharisees, in this space and having a conversation about law and, they're wanting multiple testimonies, and he's saying, well, I do have multiple testimonies, me and my Father. And part of what he's pointing back to when he says that is he's pointing back to the signs. Like, I wouldn't be able to do these things if I didn't have the power of God behind me.
Yeah.
But I do.
Yeah.
So that should be testimony enough. But then you also have my witness. And here you start seeing Jesus standing alone more than you do in other places in the text. Like, we're far enough along where as Jesus is teaching in the temple, sometimes he's standing alone.
Yeah. So as you have been calling us to put ourselves in these stories, my question is, because we now, our relationship with God isn't rule-bound in the same way that those who are, kind of pushing against Jesus are rule-bound.
I would say for some of us.
Some of us.
Right? Like, I would say anybody who's watching from a more conservatively bent congregation
is more rule-bound.
Is still pretty rule-bound, and what they think is, like, and then I would say, like, part of the expression that people who leave those systems and move to a more grace-bound space find is that freedom from that.
Well, but I was going to say that I think we bind ourselves to other rules.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think if we're tempted, it could be really tempting because we are in a bit of a more grace-bound theology at Wayzata Community Church. It'd be tempting for us to sort of distance ourselves from a story like this and say, well, that's not me. I wouldn't question Jesus in that way because I'm not that bound to the rules. I think there are other rules that we're bound to. And I think it is important. It's a little bit different for all of us.
Yeah.
I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, what rules do I hold tightly to, and what rules am I even hoping God obeys,
affirms.
if that makes sense, or affirms? Yeah.
Yeah, and like, what rules are keeping me from seeing the power of love and grace that Jesus offers the world?
Yeah.
What are the systems and structures that I've set up to do that?
And connecting that into this radical abundance that we see as a theme throughout many of these stories, how am I allowing the rules get into the way of offering radical abundance in the way of Jesus?
And I think, I think it can be like perceptions, right? Like, not just rules, but like, everybody wants to believe that their pastor is perfect, or that they're, and then we start to have to buy into that narrative, and we try to live into...
Till you start doing a video Bible study.
Right.
And then it's all documented for years to
exactly.
come, how imperfect this is.
No,
but you're totally right.
Like, we all have these things, like, what does it mean to be a wealthy, middle to upper middle class, or even wealthier Western suburbs person?
Yeah.
Like, what are the narrative we have to live into there? And how does that keep us from seeing Jesus?
I'm going to be totally honest with you and tell you that a few weeks before George Floyd was murdered, I was in a spiral, I'd call it, of reflection about how hard being in the COVID lockdown phase was for me. And in a very entitled, I don't deserve this kind of way. And that is embarrassing to admit. Part of what has been happening in Minneapolis has snapped me out of that in a way that I'm deeply grieved that it took that. But it brings me to tears because it just is a reminder of how easy it is. I see myself in this story in that way of wishing, I don't know, wishing God would operate by my rules, by my own laws.
Totally.
And what I'll tell you is there's more freedom and more life on the other side of that I'm even experiencing right now.
So much. Yeah, more than I'm experiencing as well.
And I'm supposed to know better. I mean, I say that, I guess I confess that as a pastor because I'm supposed to know better. So I don't know better.
We don't know better, and none of us know better. All of us are living in the narratives that have taken years to build up.
Yeah.
Right? That's why I think having conversations about systems of oppression and systems of chaos really matter, because none of us are who we are today because we decided to be that yesterday.
Yeah.
Right? That's why part of this COVID stuff has been so crazy, is because, all of us, we were having conversations 5 months ago about what will we do the month after COVID was done, right? Thinking that it was only going to last a month.
Yeah.
And then month 2, we're having the same conversation about month 3. You know what I mean? We never expected any of this to happen. And in the process of it, we build up narratives.
Yeah.
And then those narratives come out to play. And if we're honest and vulnerable and reflective enough, we can get to the place where you are of saying, that was I was having an entitled response to this, while there's been a group of people who I dearly love who have been living under an oppression that's far outweighs my necessity to be locked into my house for 4 months.
Right. And I turned a blind eye to it.
Yeah. Because you didn't know.
I did know, but I let myself, yeah.
Right?
I let myself get distracted.
You get distracted, and you may know pieces of it. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's a bit of an awakening. And I think that's part of what we're seeing. I think that's part of what we saw in John chapter 3 with Nicodemus when he comes to Jesus at night, is he's trying to figure it out. He's like a lot of us are in this very moment, saying man, I just don't fully get it. I'm trying to grasp it. I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
Help me.
Yeah.
Help me understand more.
Yep.
And, and you take a few steps, either forward or backward.
And I think that God is so generous to us in that space too. God is not sort of get with it, hurry up. What are you doing? God is just constantly dropping in opportunities to see the light, to let the light be illuminated. So there's hope. There's hope yet.
There is hope. And, our hope is that each of us will allow Jesus to wipe a little spit on our eyes.
Yeah, right.
Right? And move us from a place of darkness to light.
Yeah. Amen.